Продовжуємо роботу в Українському кризовому медіа-центрі. Зараз говоритимемо на тему «3 роки Майдану. Тривожні дзвіночки для прав людини». Нашими спікерами є Олександра Матвійчук, голова правління Центру громадянських свобод, Liudmyla Kozlovska, президент фундації «Відкритий діалог», Oksana Pokalchuk, виконавча директорка Amnesty International в Україні, Arkadii Bushchenko, виконавчий директор Української гельсінської спілки з прав людини. Прошу до слова.
Good morning. We would like to appreciate that all of you have appeared here in this audience. This is an informal platform which is united by the powerful, the legal human rights protection organization like the Center of the Human Liberties, the Amnesty International, Open Dialogue Foundation, the Social of the social actions, and a number of others. The reason for our press conference became the events last week when they tried to push through the parliament a number of the repressive draft laws, but our press conference was called the kind of 3 years after the Maidan, alarming signals for human rights. This is not incidental, because this actually fits into the general logic of the alarming and negative trend which we have been witnessing for over the last few years, and especially of late when it has been intensified. Actually, trying to explain this trend or this tendency, I would like to start with the following. Ukraine, for the third year now, is plunged in the war against Russian Federation, and even this undeclared war, during such undeclared war, the human rights are restricted and limited. And the human rights are not absolute and are subject to limitation or restriction, but the proportional way. What we actually observe in different spheres when they pass the governmental decisions testifies to the non-proportional limitation of human rights. What the difference? Just using the simple language, all those restrictions have to serve and lead to the objective, which has been publicly declared. But this goal can be achieved by some other ways or means. But this situation of non-proportional restriction of human rights by the authorities on the background of rhetoric of the Russian Federation aggression, there is a number of the facts which testify to that. I can name those, and they are associated with the, let's say, different movements of the human rights defense protection foundations and other NGOs and media. And my colleagues are going to speak about that, the restriction of the access to the mass media, the liberties, the campaign of discreditation of the public activists who try to fight corruption, and the words of the activists. The special service of Ukraine is associated with who. And we are talking about without any consultation with the public at large. For example, the draft law about the occupation of the Donbas area, which is in the first, let's say, pages of the mass media. They have not seen that with their own eyes. And we are talking about the formation of the armed forces, which are subordinated to the armed forces of Ukraine, in which are used for keeping the public order, which is prohibited by the Constitution of Ukraine. Again, we are talking about the protection of the peaceful gatherings, which we can observe in the capital city, in different cities of Ukraine. And the crown of that all can be regarded the attack against independence of the institution of the Verkhovna Rada authorized person. Last week they tried to push through the parliament a norm which would change the procedure of the election of such a person. This norm was actually fixed in the law on the Constitution of Ukraine, which has nothing to do with the institution of the ombudsman. Actually, we do not know what kind of tax warning will be signed by President of Ukraine, because this procedure, which is being supported by specific political forces, will help some political, let's say, bosses too easily working to push their decisions. For us, as the human rights protection organizations who joined the efforts to appear at this conference, we call it the alarming signals. This is not for the first time when we have to do something against decisions taken by the authorities, but the representatives of the authorities institutions, they are very they use emotionally and certainly this kind of the link as they are fight and combat against the Russian Federation aggression. But anyway, the society supports, at least a part of the society supports such limitations, and as a result we have a paradoxical situation which we had to have. If we do not stop, fail to stop this trend, then the Ukrainian citizens will voluntarily give away their liberties to the authorities, the liberties and freedoms for which they were shedding their blood at the Maidan, sorry to say that. I would like to remind you that all those limitations which are introduced for something different, allegedly against the enemy or those people who are not like-minded person with us, but in fact they introduce those limitations for us and our task as a country which actually carries out the implements democratic reforms, it has to follow this path. We have, yes, to win the war, but to do that we do not have to turn ourselves into totalitarian Russia-like country. At this point of time, I would like to give the floor to the executive director of the Ukrainian Helsinki Union Ukraine, Arkadii Bushchenko. Thank you, Les. I'm going to say a few words. Actually, we had really a crazy and mind-boggling week when our parliament tried to work in such a kind of powerful and very dedicated mood, and to adopt anything which, in our point of view, actually could pose danger or jeopardize the human rights. The Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights and the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Union and the Ombudsman, they were forced to come up with 4 different declarations against those legislative acts which our MPs tried to adopt. I would like to say that this is not just, some kind of coincidence or some kind of the wrong day. I believe this is a certain, let's say, peak of those alarming trends which exist, and Oleksandra aptly mentioned that for over the last 3 years. There are some attempts of the authorities to enlarge their, let's say, powers through, let's say, restriction of the rights, freedoms, and liberties of the people. This can be seen in the sphere of the freedom of speech, in different either draft laws or in the judicial practice, in the practice of our law enforcement bodies, when just for some kind of the speech or announcement that can bring you to some criminal liability or some kind of other legal liability. We are talking about the limitation of the right to peaceful gatherings under different pretexts and their reasons. And I would like to say that for several years now, I believe for the last 8 years, they've been, let's say, discussing the draft law on the freedom of peaceful gatherings, but there is no progress so far in this area, and we do not have any kind of the legal regulation in this specific issue. And those draft laws, which I'm going to talk about, actually, they remind me pretty much the Russian approach towards non-governmental organizations, NGOs. You know that in Russia, they strictly regulate the non-governmental sector, and many organizations are the so-called foreign agents, and this problem already has been in the scope of, in the focus of attention of international community, and regarding the lack of the legal grounds for such limitations. So far, we are blessed we have not reached to label such organizations the foreign agents, but the draft laws, in our opinion, are a certain step towards a situation which is available today in the Russian Federation. So our legislators believed deemed it necessary to adopt the laws which would force NGOs to report rather extensively how they use the budget, who they pay, and to report not only for themselves but also to provide information regarding their counter agents and a lot of other things as well. Besides, what actually the most amazing is the sanctions for the non-timely or delay with the submit such reports, even if there are no other violations. This could entail striking out of this organization from the register of non-profit organizations, and they will be treated like the business structures in this case, and this means the huge losses for the organization, actual debts, indebtedness for such organization. For the majority, 99% of such organizations, it would mean a kind of bankruptcy and the impossibility to continue their activities. And all this information, where they try to force those organizations to report amount, this is already available for our authorities. It just exists, So if the state would like to check this or another organization for whether it acts legally or whether there are some problems, fiscal nature, something like that, they could do that. There is no problem for the authorities to do that anyway. So we believe that those draft laws meant to make the work of such organizations more difficult or make impossible their activities. We as the organization have to report for the natural persons to the entrepreneur whom we paid a certain amount of money for some of the services. This makes the employers or the entrepreneurs not to provide the service to us, because the businesses do not have to report about that. In other words, it's easier for them to deal with other businesses because they can make more money, because the NGOs do not have such big money at their disposal. Sometimes we just pray and we try to persuade counteragents to work with us, and this is going to make their lives so difficult that they would find it absolutely uninteresting for them to deal with NGOs. And we have to make use of the services of natural persons like the entrepreneurs and other counteragents. Again, I would like to emphasize that very strict sanctions which they apply to NGOs, even the businesses do not have such sanctions for some kind of administrative violations, or if they delay their reporting, let's say, dates. And that draft law which they try to push through the parliament is the draft law 6688 regarding the introduction of amendments to ensure information security. The information security is the most favorable topic, and there is correspondingly the information war becomes for the authorities a kind of the slogan, or let's say the scarecrow to intimidate the people that we find ourselves in this kind of information, lack of information security, and they try under this pretext to push through a lot of detrimental legislative initiatives. In particular, in this draft law, they try to define the technological terrorism, and to refer this notion. For example, if the effect on decision making exert, let's say, the action on the failure to act on the part of the authorities, etc. I would like to say that any kind of NGO, our and the organizations, my colleagues, actually deal specifically with those that they try to exert the pressure on the governmental structures or authorities to adopt or to make or not to make this or that decision. This is our objective, and this actually this appeal is kind of a rather successful pressure, because those draft laws have not been adopted yet. So, but since we exert such pressure, we are regarded as technological terrorists, all of us, sitting on this platform. Unfortunately, this is kind of incessant action in many spheres. And Alexander mentioned there was a special criminal procedure of criminal process. And they are talking a lot about the expansion of the authorities of the governmental structures, because psychologically they believe that the war against the aggressor, and we have another war, the war against corruption, that this can justify anything. When we get back to corruption, then we are going to live in the law-obedient state. But unless we actually win a victory over corruption and the enemy, we cannot talk about such kind of a state. And I agree with that absolutely, and that when we got the victory on those two fronts, owing to the fact because we will lose the signs of the law-obedient state and we will be turned into authoritarian state, then in this case, this victory doesn't worth anything. I can understand what we are fighting for. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Oksana Pokalchuk. I'm the director of Amnesty International in Ukraine. I would like to add and that's about influence of the church on the state. According to the constitution, the state is separated from the church. These are separate institutions which shouldn't be influencing each other, but we see that now it's very aggressive, active offense of all religious confessions on the solutions made by Verkhovna Rada. I can talk a lot about that, and you all know how this is happening. I will draw your attention to several things. First, that's Istanbul Convention. Istanbul Convention is a convention on counteracting home violence, which is part of Europe integration commitments of our state. Ukraine was one of the co-authors of this convention. I would like to remind that Ukraine promised to ratify convention not just as part of Euro integration process, but at all the meetings with the Council of Europe, European Union. When this issue was discussed, our government was saying this convention would be ratified, and what we have, the convention is not ratified. Why? Because according to some MPs, this convention contradicts the traditional understanding of the position of husband and wife in traditional Ukrainian family. That's the influence of the church. The Council of Churches made statement that they are against this convention, and most of the NGOs made statements to support it, and Ukraine is supporting it. That's the commitment of our state. And the group of people who should be separated from the state, they influence so strongly that all our efforts, besides some legal aspect, there's another aspect. People, thousands of women and children who have no access to effective legal or psychological aid. They have nowhere to go away from violence in the family. They are left defenseless because the church believes that we shouldn't ratify this convention. There was a draft law submitted on Friday that to open and close the session of Verkhovna Rada, when opening and closing, we need to make a prayer, but it was ridiculous. But then I thought that if we look at how strongly the church influences the decisions of the Verkhovna Rada, that's bad. There's a draft law on prohibition of abortions in the Verkhovna Rada. There was a lot of noise about it. It's still on the website of Verkhovna Rada, and it could happen that under the pressure, or like Oleksandra said, they will squeeze it into another draft law, and it will be passed. And from a country which after Maidan declared about its Euro integration direction, where human rights are bigger value than anything else, but we may follow the practices of such countries as Russia and Turkey. That's not just the church, it's offense on our rights, which in half a year could be strongly limited. Thank you, and I will give the floor to Liudmyla Kozlovska, the president of Open Dialogue Foundation. Thank you, colleagues. I feel not very comfortable because usually I am a lawyer, an advocate of Ukraine at the international arena. We are fighting for the rights of political prisoners. But last month in the Council of Europe, for the first time within the last 3 years, we were talking about political persecutions of some people, of reformers. And by that we understand politicians, anti-corruption activists, or investigatory journalists. And I can say that our European partners also felt discomfortable. Those who monitor the situation in Ukraine, who come here, this time we had to give the first signals to them, the news that no one it's about that many people fall victims of persecution. And the same way, on the 27th of June this year, we made a report in the Council of Europe where for the first time we were speaking about how oligarchs are trying to get rid of effects of reforms. First of all, I mean people who are fighting corruption or who have courage to say no. And that is to have courage to announce on the biggest corruption case in Ukraine. And the document that I will talk about is a written declaration, is a declaration signed by some MPs. Each one of these MPs was in Ukraine. These are the countries which support Ukraine on its way to European integration. Like Kristina Zvinkova, she's a member of parliament, of Czech parliament. She was in the east of Ukraine. She helped us how to make a case of Nadia Savchenko, Oleg Sentsov in Czech parliament, and she's also our main advocate in the Council of Europe, and she has become the author of this declaration. On the one hand, great, the situation in Ukraine is not ideal, we understand it. We say that the General Prosecution Office continues the practice of persecution.
Служба українська політичного уходця з Росії з поворотом. І окей, ми розуміємо.
We understand There are problems, we are fighting against them, but when such people as Oleksandra Usinova or Vitaly Shabunin, who are the representatives of the largest anti-corruption organizations of such parties as Dem-Alliance or Demopomish, we're talking about Svetlana Zalishuk, who was punished for her position, or Maxim Cherkasenko, who's the chairman of the board of Dem-Alliance and was punished, or the case of Andrei Sadovy and Andrei Zhurzhi in Samopovich. No one's going to tolerate such things, and the first signal has been made. We were invited to other international organizations to present our report, and our task is to clearly support those people who are fighting for changes in Ukraine, and this is a very clear signal for today's authorities. And we believe that, unfortunately, within the last year, we see when the authorities are used to persecute activists and political opponents. That's a very dangerous trend. We are together with Ukraine. We are ready to support all the positive and anti-corruption reforms, but no one will tolerate political persecutions. Thank you. We have time left for just one brief question and one very brief answer. Very brief. Juliana Pakshutkina, MP, Народный депутат magazine. What is the situation with human rights in Ukraine compared to other countries? Are we lagging behind? Are we ahead of others? I will answer. It's difficult to compare when you have to compare. The comparison is a very difficult thing because human rights is always intersectional, and we need to look at each case separately. The comparison which I opened, that's comparison with Turkey and Russia. I believe these are the most totalitarian countries in our region for me. This is obvious that we as the country are moving in their direction, not in the direction of human rights, as is declared by the European Convention on Human Rights or the Human Rights Declaration. I would not compare with all the countries. If we have to compare, we take separate aspects, separate laws, how they influence in other countries and in our country. And what Arkadii Bushchenko said, that the laws which are passed in Ukraine, which influence the civil society, they are copied from the practices which exist in Russian Federation. Thank you. If you have other questions, please ask them off records. Thank you.